It's not fair. Have you heard those words from your kids lately? Or have you used them? And whatever it is you might bring with you this morning, my hunch is there's something on your heart that you're connecting those words with. Whether it's something that you're facing in your family or something that you're facing at work or something here at church, my hunch is it's not fair, or words that could be closely directed to whatever you're facing in your life. Those were words that were pretty prominent in our story for this morning, the story of the workers in the vineyard. And it's a story that, it's certainly not one of the most popular stories in the Bible, but it's one that I think most of us are familiar with. And it's really a pretty simple story. This landowner goes out at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he hires people to work for him in his vineyard. And he agrees to pay them a denarius, or a day's wage, $2.50. And this was a common practice during Jesus' time, especially with grapes in the vineyards. Because when the grapes were ripe and a storm was coming, or the weather was changing rapidly, the storms could easily ruin the crops. And so the owner of the land knew he had to go hire workers in the vineyard quickly. So for a time, anyone who wanted a job could have a job. It was almost guaranteed. They had to work hard from sunrise to sunset. The wage, though, was standard. A denarius, or a silver coin. A day's wage. And actually, a family could live on that pretty well. So the landowner goes out at 6 in the morning. He gets workers. He takes them back. He puts them to work for a denarius. But he realized, for some reason, he needed more workers. And so at 9 o'clock, he goes back into the marketplace, and he saw others standing around, and he told them, go and work in the vineyard, and I'll pay you what's right. So they go. At noon, the same scenario. And then at 3, the same scenario. He goes back, and he gets more workers. Only this time he said to them, why are you standing idle in the marketplace? And they said, because no one's hired us. And the owner said, come and work for me. And finally, the end of the day comes, and the landowner goes to the foreman or the manager, and he said, call my workers in and pay them their wages. And here's one of the keys to the story. Call them in from the beginning with the last who were hired, and then work your way down to the first and pay them. So the workers who started working at 5 in the afternoon, they got paid a day's wage, a denarius. And those who started at 3 got the same, a denarius, a day's wage. Those who started at 6 in the morning, they expected more. Wow, this farmer is so generous. Maybe a week's wage, maybe a month. But each of them got a denarius, a day's wage. And it's what they agreed upon. Now they were irate. And the text tells us that they began to grumble against the landowner. It's not fair. It's not fair. These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour We worked the whole day. We worked in the heat of the day. It's not fair. But then the landowner said, and this is Jesus telling the story. The landowner said, we agreed on this. Can't I do with my money what I want? And now comes the great reversal. As Jesus always was doing in stories. Jesus said, the first or the last will be first, and the first will be last. It's not fair. Now, when I was a kid growing up, my sisters and I would pull that line on my mom on occasion. And I can still tell you very clearly my mom's response. When we would say, it's not fair, my mom often said, the fair comes to town the first week in August. And obviously this story took place before the creation of unions. Imagine what unions would say to this story. Some worked 12 hours, some worked 1 hour, and they all got paid the same. Well, hopefully we don't forget that this is a story told by Jesus. And every parable, every story that Jesus told had to do with his kingdom and his world, which was different than the ways of the world. And here's the obvious part of this story. Fortunately, his kingdom, Jesus' kingdom, has nothing to do with how hard and how long we work. This is a difficult lesson for us to accept, especially in our own country when we focus on how hard we have to work. Especially when we come to church this morning when we're exhausted and we've worked hard all week and we finally get a day to just kind of rest. It's a hard lesson. Some years ago, I went to Salt Lake City, the home of the Mormons, and I went to see the Mormon Tabernacle. And I was there for a day, and I remember just some of the things that happened around the town. The city was beautiful, and people were just very hospitable. But the one thing that I didn't expect was, and I didn't even realize it at the time, in Salt Lake City they have the largest genealogy library in the world. And I didn't realize it until someone started educating me that the Mormons actually believe that actually someone just fell out the steps. If someone else could. Yeah, thank you. So, going to the Mormon Tabernacle, is that where I was at? That's where I was at. I got there and found this genealogy library, and I didn't know why it was there and why it was the largest in the world until they told me the Mormons believe that if someone in your family was not baptized, in order to get to heaven you had to be baptized, and you could actually be baptized for them. And when you were baptized for them, it got them entrance into heaven, but it also gained rewards for you in life. And so people from all around the world came in this genealogy library to see if their loved ones were baptized or not. But I remember sitting outside of there. One of my kids had fallen asleep in a stroller, and I just sat out there for like 2 hours. I can still remember all these people rushing in and out, working so hard to get the reward of baptizing for someone else. I remember going to Tanzania, and the first time I went, we got to this city, and the town greeted us with dancing and celebration, and we were ready to get started in our clinic, and then they broke into this worship service for 3 hours. And we stood there celebrating and worshiping with them. And when it was over with, one of the Tanzanian women came to me, and I could tell she was starting to talk, and someone was sort of helping her interpret, and I'm thinking she's going to be talking about faith, or how are things working in the clinic. But she said to me, "You Americans work hard." And I didn't know if that was a compliment or not. And we have all of these quotes in our lives today that focused around working hard. Someone said a dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes hard work. Tommy Helfinger said, "Success is the result of loyalty, learning from your failures, and hard work." Ann Landers, in her column, said, "Opportunities are usually disguised as hard work, so most people don't always recognize it." Vince Lombardi said, "The price of success is a lot of hard work." And then there's Jesus. And I've been talking about how Jesus surprises us, and how Jesus does these backward things compared to society. Jesus does these upside down things. And just after he tells this parable, his last words were, "The last will be first, and the first will be last." It's a hard lesson, especially since in our society, we often hear the words, in order to get ahead of other people, you have to work harder. Or when something good happens to someone, we often hear, this is due to hard work. Or when someone makes it to the top, or CEO of an organization, or a superintendent, or whatever it might be, often people say, she worked her way up the ladder. And even as Christians, we get caught up in this hard work mentality. And as much as some of it's true, and there's many virtues to working hard, it does not give us salvation. Only Jesus can. And this parable, we often title it as the parable of the workers in the vineyard, but it's really the parable of generosity. A complete and unconditional gift that God gives to us is called love, and it's limitless. And God plays no favorites. I'm glad of that. Because if that was the case, my luck often would be I would get into heaven, and there walking in before me was Mother Teresa, or Billy Graham, or Martin Luther King Jr. You can't earn salvation because you already have it. God favored that to us. God created us with all of our gifts that we have, that are all outward. And we often can tell what those are. But God also created us within the gift of love. Whether you've given your heart to Jesus 50 years ago, and you've been working in the vineyard all of these years, or whether you gave your heart to Jesus this morning, His love is so massive that it covers all. When Jesus went to the cross, all social statuses, classes, all races, all borders, they became second compared to covering people with His love. And then on the third day he rose from the dead, which was the ultimate sign of his love, which covers us our entire lives, and he wants us to follow in that path. I usually don't repeat sermons or illustrations, but I showed this illustration on Ash Wednesday. And as you think about following, this wisdom of the wolves is very vital. If you look in the front, the three wolves that are circled in red, and for some reason I couldn't get the image to focus in the way I wanted, but they're actually the oldest and the sickest of the wolves. And the next five, which are in the yellow box, they're actually the strongest in the pack. And they're the best travelers. And they protect those in front of them and on the side. And the pack in the middle, which is the most, they're the youngest. Sometimes not with all of the wisdom, but they're protected by the best of all in the pack. And then there's the five behind. And they're, again, the best and the strongest, and they're protecting the back side of the pack. But the key to this is the one, and I saw this illustration some time ago that didn't have the purple arrow. I didn't even notice the last one in the back. It's the leader of the pack who is following. And the leader in the pack continues to bark or howl or whatever wolves do in order to unify and to keep the pack on vision and on track. And when I was reading one of these studies of some environmentalist who spent his whole life studying wolves, he said oftentimes that wolf in the back, after they get to their destination, has no voice left to bark or to howl, because they've been doing so much of that, keeping the pack on track. As we think of our lives in Christ, we have been filled with amazing grace, and we have been filled with unconditional love. And God invites us to follow Christ, to lead and to follow.